What I'm about to tell you happened across the American Midwest during one of the most pivotal decades in farming history. While I've woven together details from multiple documented cases to create this narrative, every financial figure, every piece of equipment, every economic pressure you're about to hear is pulled directly from USDA agricultural census data, Federal Reserve lending reports, and interviews with farmers who lived through the farm mechanization boom of the early 1970s. This is a story of choices made when American agriculture stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernization, between caution and risk, between what your neighbors were doing and what your gut told you was right. The name was Vernon Hastings, and in Colfax County, Nebraska, in the winter of 1971, that name didn't carry much weight anymore. Not the way it used to. Not the way his father's name had. Back when Lawrence Hastings ran 800 acres of the best corn and soybean ground in the eastern part of the state, and nobody questioned a Hastings when it came to farming. Vernon was 43 that winter, tall, lean in the way men get when they work hard and eat simple. His hands were scarred from 40 years of handling machinery, fence wire, and livestock. His face had the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking into Nebraska wind. He wore the same Carhartt jacket his father had worn, patched at the elbows with denim his wife Martha had stitched on during the winter of '68. He farmed 420 acres, not the 800 his father had managed. Vernon had sold off parcels over the years when times got tight, when the bank came calling, when equipment needed replacing, and the crop prices didn't cover what they should have. What he had left was good ground, paid for, his name on the deed with no mortgage hanging over it. That mattered to Vernon more than almost anything. In his machine shed sat a 1952 Oliver 88 row crop tractor, green and yellow paint, most of the original, some of it touched up over the years with whatever Vernon could mix to match. The Oliver had been old when his father bought it used in '59. It was ancient now by the standard of 1971, when the neighbors were rolling in with new iron that gleamed under the autumn sun during harvest. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what was happening in American agriculture in 1971. According to the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, the average investment in machinery per farm had increased by 84% between 1960 and 1970. The John Deere 4020, which had become the standard bearer for modern farming, cost about $6,800 new in 1971. That's roughly $52,000 in today's money. Farmers were being told by manufacturers, by dealers, by farm magazines, by their county extension agents, that bigger equipment meant more efficiency, more acres covered, more profit. The pressure to modernize wasn't just economic. It was social. It was about keeping up, about not being left behind, about proving you were a real farmer in the new era of American agriculture. Vernon's neighbors had gotten that message loud and clear. In March of '71, Dale Kirkman, who farmed the section directly east of Vernon's land, drove into his yard in a brand new John Deere 4020. Dale was 36, younger than Vernon by 7 years, and he'd inherited his father's farm debt-free, just like Vernon had. The tractor was beautiful. 91 horsepower, 8 forward speeds, power steering, deluxe seat with cushioned backrest. It smelled like fresh paint and hydraulic fluid and possibility. Dale stopped by Vernon's shed that afternoon. Vernon was underneath his Oliver, which was up on blocks, transmission pan off, parts laid out on a clean tarp in the order he'd removed them. Vernon, Dale said, standing in the doorway, backlit by March sunlight. "You're tearing into that thing again?" Vernon slid out from under the tractor, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. Synchronizers worn. Third gear's been grinding since October. Dale looked at the Oliver, then back at his new Deere sitting in Vernon's driveway, then back at Vernon. "You know, Midwest Implement's got a finance deal right now. 3.9% on new equipment. Deferred payment until after harvest. You could be out of that antique by next week." Vernon stood up slowly, his knees cracking. This antique put in 300 acres of corn last spring, without missing a beat. How many times did you stop to adjust the carburetor? Few times. How many times did you have to pull the starter because the battery wouldn't turn it over? Vernon smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It starts." Dale shook his head. It's 1971, Vernon. You're farming like it's 1952. That Oliver's going to leave you stranded in the field one of these days. And then what? You'll lose your planting window. Your corn will go in late. Your yield will drop, and you'll be further behind than ever. Maybe, Vernon said, or maybe I'll keep fixing it, keep farming, and keep my land paid for. Dale didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded toward his new tractor. That deer out there? It's not about showing off, Vernon. It's about efficiency. It's about survival. You can't compete with 1950s equipment in a 1970s market. After Dale left, Vernon went back under the Oliver. He didn't think much about the conversation. He'd heard variations of it before. But Dale wasn't the only one. By May of '71, 3 more of Vernon's neighbors had bought new tractors. Jim Peterson, who farmed north of Vernon, got a John Deere 4320 with 135 horsepower and a cab with air conditioning. Air conditioning in a tractor. Vernon had heard about it, but couldn't quite picture the point of it. Ray Stoltz, to the south, bought a 4020 like Dale's. And Warren Bickle, who farmed a narrow strip along the western edge of Vernon's land, traded up from an old Farmel to a new Deere 3020. The bank was making it easy. Farmer State Bank in Schuyler, the county seat, was practically throwing money at equipment loans. The loan officer, a man named Gordon Klemp who'd been hired from Omaha and didn't know corn from soybeans when he first arrived, was young and ambitious and believed what the John Deere salesman told him about the future of agriculture being in mechanized efficiency. Gordon stopped by Vernon's place in early June, driving a new Buick with dealer plates still in the window. He found Vernon greasing the Oliver's steering linkage. "Mr. Hastings," Gordon said, stepping carefully around a puddle of old motor oil, "I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity." Vernon kept working the grease gun. "I'm listening." "I've been reviewing the loan portfolios for farm equipment in the county, and I noticed you haven't financed any new machinery in over a decade." "Haven't needed to." "Well, that's one way to look at it," Gordon said, pulling out a folder from under his arm. "But another way to look at it is that you're missing out on significant tax advantages, depreciation benefits, and most importantly, the productivity gains that modern equipment provides." Vernon wiped his hands and finally looked at the banker. "What's the interest rate?" 3.9% fixed for 5 years. Payments deferred until after harvest. We can approve you for up to $15,000 based on your land equity. $15,000. That was 3.5 years of net income for Vernon's farm in a good year. Maybe 4 years in a normal year. "What happens if I have a bad crop?" Vernon asked. Gordon smiled the way young men smile when they think they have all the answers. "That's what crop insurance is for, Mr. Hastings. Besides, with modern equipment, bad crops become less likely. You'll plant faster, cultivate more efficiently, harvest with less loss." Vernon looked back at his Oliver. "This tractor's never failed me when it mattered." "It's 19 years old," Gordon said, and there was something in his tone that made Vernon's jaw tighten. Not quite condescension, but close. "The Deere 4020 I could get you into would last another 20 years with basic maintenance. You'd be farming with equipment from the 1970s instead of equipment from the 1950s. There's a difference, Mr. Hastings. A big difference." After Gordon left, Martha came out from a house. She'd been listening from the kitchen window. "What do you think?" she asked. Vernon was quiet for a long moment, looking at the Oliver. "I think that bankers never planted a row of corn in his life, and I think every one of our neighbors is taking on debt they might not be able to service if things go sideways." "Things have been pretty steady," Martha said carefully. "They have," Vernon agreed, "but steady don't mean permanent." That summer, Vernon planted his corn with the Oliver, same as always. It took him longer than it took Dale, or Jim, or Ray. They'd roar past on a county road, their new Deeres pulling 4-row planters, covering ground fast, dust rising behind them. Vernon's Oliver pulled a 2-row planter his father had bought in the 50s, and Vernon planted his acres methodically, checking depth constantly, adjusting the planter by hand, when the ground changed from sandy loam to heavier clay. At the feed store in Schuyler, the talk was all about the new equipment. Farmers stood around the seed display and talked about horsepower, hydraulics, and financing deals. Some of them glanced at Vernon when he came in, and he could read it in their faces. Pity mostly, some amusement. The old-timer who wouldn't change with the times. Vernon didn't mind. He'd been called worse. But there was one conversation that stuck with him. He'd been loading fence posts into his truck bed when he heard two farmers talking inside the store, their voices carrying through the open door. Hastings is going to farm himself into ground with that old Oliver, one said. Vernon recognized the voice. It was Cal Henderson, a man who bought 640 acres on borrowed money in '68 and had been expanding ever since. He's land rich and cash poor, another voice said. Too stubborn to modernize, too proud to admit he's fallen behind. Give it 3 years, Cal said. He'll have to sell out. Can't compete with 50-year-old equipment forever. Vernon finished loading his posts, climbed into his truck, and drove home. He didn't say anything to Martha about what he'd heard. But that night, after dinner, he went out to Machine's shed and looked at the Oliver for a long time. The tractor was worn, no question. The paint was faded. The seat was patched. The steering wheel was smooth from decades of hands gripping it, his father's hands. Then his. The gauges were cloudy. The engine leaked oil from a dozen places no matter how many gaskets Vernon replaced. But the bones of it were sound. The block was good. The transmission, once he'd finished rebuilding it, would be solid. The rear end was strong. And it was paid for. Completely, utterly paid for. Now, let me tell you what the economic data was showing in 1971, because this matters for understanding what Vernon was up against. According to the Federal Reserve's agricultural lending surveys, farm debt in the United States had increased from $24 billion in 1960 to $53 billion in 1971. That's more than doubled in just over a decade. The average farm operating loan had gone from $1,800 to nearly $6,000. Why? Mechanization, land expansion, the push toward what they were calling economies of scale. The agricultural extension services, the universities, the USDA itself, everyone was preaching the same gospel. Get bigger or get out. Invest in equipment. Expand your acreage. Increase your efficiency. Compete in the modern market. And for a while, it worked. Corn yields were climbing. Soybean production was increasing. The export markets were opening up. But all that growth was being fueled by debt. Massive debt. And debt is a tool that cuts both ways. Vernon understood this in his gut. Even if he couldn't quote the Federal Reserve statistics. He'd watched his father farm to the 50s, through droughts and price crashes in years when the corn barely made enough to cover the seed cost. He'd learned that the farmer who could weather the bad years was the farmer who survived. And the farmer who could weather the bad years was the farmer who didn't owe anybody anything. So that winter, the winter of 71 into 72, Vernon did what he'd done every winter for the past decade. He rebuilt the Oliver. He started in November, right after harvest was in. The corn had been decent that year, not spectacular, but decent. Enough to pay the property taxes. Enough to cover the seed and fertilizer for next year. Enough to put a little aside. Not enough to buy a new tractor. Not even close. But enough to live on. Vernon pulled the Oliver into the heated section of his machine shed. The 15 by 20 space where he kept the wood stove going and where the temperature stayed just warm enough to work without gloves. He'd learned decades ago that you couldn't do precise mechanical work with numb fingers. He started with the obvious problems. The engine was burning oil more than it should, so the rings probably needed replacing. The clutch was starting to slip under heavy load. The brakes, never the Oliver's strong point, were barely functional. The electrical system was a mess of corroded connections and frayed wires. The hydraulics were leaking from the pump seals. Any one of these problems would have sent most farmers to the dealership. All of them together, on a 19-year-old tractor, would have been reason enough to trade up. But Vernon saw it differently. He saw a winter's worth of work. He saw parts he could order from salvage yards and tractor graveyards and small engine shops. He saw problems he could solve with patience and skill, and the knowledge his father had passed down to him. He pulled the engine first, using a chain hoist his grandfather had installed in the shed rafters back in the 30s. The Oliver's engine was heavy, cast iron, built in an era when tractors were designed to be rebuilt rather than replaced. Vernon cleaned every piece as he disassembled it, laying out gaskets and bearings and valve springs on his workbench in precise order. He found a rebuilding kit for the engine through a mail-order catalog out of Iowa. Cost him $87, including shipping, which was a fortune for Vernon, but still a fraction of what a new tractor would cost. The kit included new piston rings, bearings, gaskets, and seals. Everything he needed to bring the engine back to factory specifications. December came, and with it the cold. The kind of cold that settles into your bones, that makes metal brittle and hard to work with. Vernon kept the wood stove stoked, burning oak and ash he'd cut from the fence line. Martha brought him coffee twice a day and sandwiches at noon, and she never complained about the hours he spent in the shed, about the diesel smell that clung to his clothes, about the fact that other farmers were inside watching television, while her husband was knuckles deep in a tractor that most people thought should have been scrapped years ago. Vernon honed the cylinders himself, using a honing tool he'd borrowed from the machine shop in Schuyler. He fitted the new rings carefully, checking the gap on each one, making sure they seated properly. He replaced the bearings, torqued the main caps to specification, using a manual he'd ordered from Oliver years ago, back when Oliver was still in business before they got bought out by White Motor Corporation. The work was meditative, precise. Every bolt had to be torqued to the right specification. Every gasket had to be sealed properly. Every bearing had to be set to the correct clearance. There was no room for shortcuts, no way to fake it. The tractor would either run right or it wouldn't, and Vernon would know within minutes of starting it whether he'd done the work properly. By Christmas, he had the engine back together. He didn't install it yet. He wanted to rebuild the clutch and transmission while he had easy access. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Dale stopped by on Christmas Eve, bringing a bottle of whiskey, and found Vernon in the shed, the tractor's transmission torn apart on the workbench. "You're missing the church social," Dale said. "I'll catch the next one," Vernon replied, examining a synchronizer gear under the work light. Dale poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed one to Vernon. "You know what I did today? I put fuel stabilizer in my Deere, cover it with a tarp, and I'm done until spring. 15 minutes of work, and I can spend the winter with my family." Vernon took the whiskey, sipped it. "Good stuff. Better than he usually bought." "You're a lucky man, Dale." "You could be too. That loan offer's probably still good." Vernon set down the whiskey and picked up the gear again. "This synchronizer's worn out. See here." He pointed to the teeth. "Ground down from 19 years of shifting. I've got a replacement coming from a salvage yard in Kansas. Cost me $12. I'll install it, and this transmission will be good for another 20 years. Dale looked at the parts spread across the workbench, at Vernon's oil-stained hands, at the ancient tractor that was basically a pile of components at this point. "What if you can't get it back together?" Vernon smiled. "I've been taking this thing apart since I was 14 years old. I'll get it back together." After Dale left, Vernon kept working. He replaced the synchronizers, replaced the worn shift forks, replaced the seals in the hydraulic pump. He cleaned every bearing, every gear, every shaft. He found cracks in the clutch pressure plate and ordered a replacement from a shop in Omaha that specialized in old Oliver parts. Cost him $38, but it was the right part, the correct specification, not some cheap aftermarket substitute. January came. The coldest January in 15 years, according to the radio. The kind of cold where your truck wouldn't start without a block heater, where the livestock needed extra feed just to maintain body heat, where the wind came down from the Dakotas and cut through every layer of clothing you wore. Vernon worked through it. Some days, he only managed 2 or 3 hours in the shed before the cold drove him inside. Other days, he worked straight through, keeping the wood stove so hot that he could work in shirt sleeves despite the temperature outside. He rewired the entire electrical system, replacing every corroded connection, every frayed wire. He installed a new voltage regulator and a rebuilt generator he'd found through a classified ad in the back of Farm Journal magazine. He rebuilt the carburetor, replacing the war needle valve and float, adjusting the mixture screws to factory specifications. By February, he was ready to reassemble. He installed the transmission first, bolting it to the frame, connecting the linkages, adjusting the clutch free play. Then he lifted the engine back into place with the chain hoist, working slowly, carefully, guiding it onto the engine mounts, lining up the bell housing, connecting the clutch. It took 3 days to get everything bolted together, connected, adjusted. 3 days of constant work, of checking and rechecking, of making sure every connection was tight, every adjustment was correct. And then, on a gray afternoon in late February when the temperature was hovering right around freezing and a light snow was falling, Vernon was ready to start it. Martha came out to the shed. She didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, watching. Vernon climbed onto the Oliver seat, the seat he'd patched himself with vinyl and foam, the same seat his father had sat in thousands of times. He checked the throttle, made sure it was set to the right position. He checked the choke. He turned the key, and the starter engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, and then it fired. The sound was deep, strong, solid. The exhaust note was clean, no smoke, no misfiring. The engine settled into a smooth idle, and Vernon sat there listening to it, feeling the vibration through the seat, and for the first time in months he smiled. Martha was smiling too. She walked over, and Vernon helped her up on the fender, and they sat there together, listening to the Oliver run. "Sounds good," she said. "Sounds perfect," Vernon replied. Now here's what was happening in the broader agricultural economy at this exact moment, and why Vernon's choice to rebuild rather than finance was about to matter more than anyone realized. In 1972, commodity prices were still relatively stable. Corn was averaging about $1.25 per bushel. Soybeans were around $3. Not great prices, but predictable. Farmers could plan around them, but the costs were rising faster than the income. Fuel costs were starting to climb as global oil markets became unstable. Fertilizer prices were increasing, and most significantly, land prices were accelerating. In Nebraska, farmland that had sold for $300 an acre in 1970 was selling for $500 an acre by 1972. This inflation was creating a bubble, though most people didn't see it yet. They saw rising land values as wealth, as equity they could borrow against. The banks certainly saw it that way. But bubbles always burst, and this one was getting ready to. Spring came late in 72. A wet, cold spring that kept farmers' outfields weeks longer than normal. When the ground finally dried enough to plant, there was a rush to get the crops in before the optimal planting window closed. Vernon's neighbors roared into their fields with their new equipment. Dale, Jim, Ray, Warren, all of them running their big tractors 12, 14 hours a day, covering massive amount of ground, getting their corn and beans in fast. Vernon took his rebuilt Oliver and his 2-row planter and methodically worked through his 420 acres. It took him longer, yes, but he planted every row at the correct depth, at the correct spacing, and when he was done, he knew the job was done right. The summer of 72 was brutal, hot and dry. By July, the corn was stressed, leaves curling in the afternoon heat, and the beans looked stunted. Everyone's crops were suffering, not just Vernon's. At the feed store, the talk turned pessimistic. Predictions of low yields, worries about making loan payments. But Vernon's crops, planted with his old Oliver, didn't look any worse than anyone else's. In fact, in some places they looked better. The careful spacing, the correct depth, the methodical attention to detail in planting, it showed up in the stand consistency, in the uniformity of the crop. When harvest came that fall, yields were down across the county. Dale's corn made 85 bushels per acre, down from his usual 120. Jim's was similar. Ray's beans only made 28 bushels instead of his normal 40. Vernon's corn made 90 bushels per acre. His beans made 32. Not spectacular numbers, but better than his neighbors, and achieved with a tractor that hadn't cost him anything except time and parts. The numbers mattered because of what came next. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out in the Middle East, and within weeks, the Arab oil embargo slammed into the American economy like a freight train. Fuel prices doubled, then tripled. Diesel that cost 35 cents a gallon in 1972 was suddenly pushing past $1 a gallon by early 74. The impact on agriculture was immediate and devastating. Farmers who financed their new equipment based on fuel costs and operating expenses from previous years suddenly found themselves underwater. The loan payments didn't change, but the cost to run the equipment skyrocketed. Dale Kirkman's new John Deere 4020 consumed 6 gallons of diesel per hour under load. At the old fuel prices, that was about $2.10 per hour. At the new prices, it was over $6 per hour. Multiply that across hundreds of hours of field work, and the numbers became crushing. Vernon's Oliver 88 consumed about 4 gallons per hour. But more importantly, Vernon had adapted to the fuel crisis in ways the newer tractors couldn't. The Oliver's simpler engine could burn lower-grade fuel. Vernon started mixing his diesel with reclaimed oil from the implement dealer's waste tank, something the newer tractors' fuel injection systems couldn't handle. He slowed down his field work, ran at lower RPMs, saved fuel by being more deliberate. But the fuel crisis was just the beginning. By mid-74, the entire agricultural economy was unraveling. Commodity prices crashed as export markets dried up. Corn had spiked to over $3 a bushel in the brief boom of 73, dropped back down to $2, then lower. Soybeans collapsed from $12 per bushel to under $5, and the loans came due. Farmers State Bank started calling in notes. Gordon Klemp, the young loan officer who'd been so enthusiastic about equipment financing, was replaced by a harder man from the main office in Lincoln, a man named Drucker who looked at numbers, not at people. Dale Kirkman missed his first payment in March of 74, the second payment in September. By January of 75, the bank foreclosed on his equipment. The John Deere 4020, less than 4 years old, was repossessed and sold at auction for $4,200, barely enough to cover half the remaining loan balance. Dale had to give the bank a lien on his land to make up the difference. Jim Peterson lost his 4320. Ray Stoltz managed to keep his 4020, but only by selling off 80 acres of his farm. Warren Bickle went completely under, lost his equipment, lost his land, moved to Omaha to work in a meat packing plant. According to USDA data, between 1973 and 1975, farm foreclosures in Nebraska increased by 63%. Equipment repossessions tripled. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre in 72 was now barely fetching $300, and there weren't many buyers even at that price. Vernon Hastings kept farming. His Oliver, rebuilt and paid for, consumed less fuel than the newer tractors and required no loan payments. When parts broke, he fixed them. When the economy crashed, his costs didn't spiral because he wasn't servicing debt. In the spring of 75, Dale stopped by Vernon's place. His truck was older now, rusty, the same truck he'd been driving before he bought the John Deere. He looked older, too, thinner, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Vernon was in the machine shed, the Oliver up on blocks again. Spring maintenance, replacing the water pump that had started leaking. "Vernon," Dale said from the doorway. Vernon slid out from under the tractor, wiping his hands. "Dale." They stood there for a moment, and Vernon could see Dale was struggling with something. "I should have listened to you," Dale finally said. "About the equipment, about the financing." Vernon shook his head. "You couldn't have known what was coming. None of us could. You knew enough not to take on debt you couldn't handle." "I got lucky," Vernon said. "That's all." But it wasn't luck, and they both knew it. It was caution. It was discipline. It was a willingness to work harder, to spend winters rebuilding, to ignore the pressure keep up with everyone else. Dale looked at the Oliver. "You still running that thing?" "Every day." "How's it holding up?" Vernon smiled. "Better than most of the new equipment. Simpler. Less to go wrong. When something does break, I can fix it." Dale nodded slowly. "I'm going to have to start doing what you do. Keeping equipment longer. Fixing instead of replacing." "It's not a bad way to live," Vernon said. After Dale left, Vernon went back to work on the water pump. As he torqued down the bolts, he thought about all the conversations over the past 4 years, all the pressure to modernize, all the implications that he was behind the times, that he was farming wrong. Maybe he had been farming wrong by the standards of 1971, but by the standards of 1975, when half his neighbors were facing bankruptcy and the other half were barely hanging on, Vernon's approach didn't look so foolish anymore. Now I want to take a moment to pull back from Vernon's story and talk about what we can learn from this period, because the lessons here reach far beyond one farmer and one tractor. The farm crisis of the mid-1970s was a turning point in American agriculture, and it exposed fundamental truths about debt, about risk management, about the difference between efficiency and resilience. Agricultural economists still study this period in universities today because it demonstrates what happens when an entire industry takes on massive debt based on the assumption that commodity prices will remain high and stable. The farmers who survived that crisis weren't necessarily the ones with the newest equipment or the most acres. They were the ones with the least debt, the ones who could weather bad years without losing everything. Vernon understood something that a lot of his neighbors didn't, that in farming, survival is more important than growth, that steady beats spectacular, that the farmer who can still plant crops when everyone else has been foreclosed on is the farmer who wins in the long run. The years after 75 were hard for everyone, but Vernon made it through. He kept farming his 420 acres. He kept rebuilding his Oliver every winter. In 76, he replaced the clutch again. In 77, he rebuilt the hydraulic pump. In 78, he machined new bushings for the front axle. Each winter, he found something that needed attention, and each winter, he fixed it. His neighbors started coming to him for advice. How did he keep the old equipment running? Where did he find parts? How did he manage without financing? Vernon shared what he knew. He wasn't possessive about his knowledge. He understood that everyone was struggling, and if he could help, he would. By 1979, the agricultural economy had stabilized somewhat. Prices recovered a little. Land values started climbing again, though not at the insane pace of the early 70s. The survivors, the farmers who'd made it through, were more cautious now, more conservative, less likely to believe the promises of dealers and bankers about endless growth and easy money. Dale Kirkman, who'd lost his John Deere 4020 to repossession, bought a used Farmel M from a farm auction. The tractor was from the 50s, older even than Vernon's Oliver, and Dale spent that winter rebuilding it in his shed. He called Vernon twice for advice, and Vernon drove over both times, spent an afternoon helping Dale adjust the timing and set the valve clearances. The Oliver 88 that Vernon had rebuilt in the winter of 71 was still running in the spring of 1980. 28 years old by then, but solid, strong, reliable. Vernon had replaced almost every component at least once. The engine had been rebuilt twice more. The transmission had been refreshed. But the frame, the bones of it, were still original, still strong. That spring, a young farmer from the eastern part of the county stopped by Vernon's place. His name was Tom Brewster, and he was 24 years old, just starting out, trying to make it farming 80 acres he'd inherited from his grandfather. He drove an old Chevy pickup and wore second-hand boots. Vernon was greasing the Oliver when Tom walked up. "Mr. Hastings?" Tom said, "I heard you might be willing to give some advice." Vernon set down the grease gun. "What do you need to know?" "I'm trying to decide whether to finance a newer tractor or to find an old one and rebuild it. Everyone I talk to says different things. My father-in-law says I should finance. The banker says I should finance. But I've been hearing stories about what happened to farmers back in the 70s, and I'm not sure I want to take on that much debt." Vernon looked at this young man, at his earnest face, at the uncertainty there, and he saw himself 30 years ago, trying to figure out how to make a living from the land without losing everything. "Come here," Vernon said. He walked Tom around the Oliver, showing the work he'd done, the rebuilt engine, the refreshed transmission, the new water pump, the replaced hydraulics. "This tractor's older than you are," Vernon said, "but it'll run another 20 years if I take care of it. You know why?" Tom shook his head. "Because when something breaks, I can fix it. Because the design is simple enough that I understand every system. Because I'm not paying someone else to keep it running. And most importantly, Because I don't owe a bank a single dollar on it. When the crops fail, when prices drop, when things go wrong, this tractor doesn't care. It doesn't need a loan payment. It just needs fuel and oil and someone willing to turn a wrench. Tom looked at the Oliver for a long moment. But it takes time. All this maintenance, all this rebuilding. It does, Vernon agreed. But you know what takes more time? Losing your farm because you can't make your loan payments. Working a second job in town because you over-leverage yourself on equipment. Watching the bank auction off everything your grandfather left you. Vernon let that sink in, then continued. You're young. You've got time. Spend it learning how to fix things, how to maintain equipment, how to farm within your means. The flashy new tractor will feel good for about 6 months. The security of owning your equipment free and clear will feel good for the rest of your life. Tom nodded slowly. Where do I start? Vernon smiled. Same place I started. Find an old tractor that still has good bones. Bring it home. Tear it apart. Learn every system. Rebuild it, and then take care of it. Tom thanked him and left, and Vernon went back to greasing the Oliver's steering linkage. He didn't know if the young man would take his advice. Probably not, he figured. Young people usually have to learn these lessons the hard way, same as everyone else. But 3 weeks later, Tom stopped by again. This time he was pulling a trailer with an old Ford 8N on it. The tractor was rough, paint faded, engine seized, but the frame looked solid. Think you could help me get started on this? Tom asked. Vernon looked at the Ford, at the young farmer standing there with hope and determination in his eyes, and he thought about his father, who'd taught him everything he knew about tractors and farming and making it through the hard times. Let's push it into my shed, Vernon said. First thing we need to do is get that engine freed up. They worked together that afternoon and into the evening, and Vernon showed Tom how to remove the spark plugs, how to pour penetrating oil into cylinders, how to be patient with seized metal. He showed him the same things his father had shown him 40 years ago, and as he taught, he realized that this was as important as any crop he'd ever planted. This was how knowledge survived. This was how the old ways, the careful ways, the ways that didn't require massive debt and constant growth, this was how they got passed down. The Oliver sat nearby, idling quietly, and Vernon could hear his father's voice in that engine sound, and his grandfather's voice before that, all the way back to men who'd farmed the same land with horses and hand tools, and the knowledge that the land would take care of you if you took care of it. Now, before I finish, I want to talk about where we are today, because the lessons from Vernon's story aren't just historical curiosities. They're principles that apply right now, in modern agriculture, where a new combine can cost $600,000 and farmers are making equipment decisions that will affect their operations for decades. The pressure to modernize, to have the biggest and newest equipment, that pressure hasn't gone away. If anything, it's intensified. But the fundamental mathematics haven't changed. Debt is still debt. A loan payment is still a loan payment. And the farmers who weather the inevitable downturns are still the ones who can operate without crushing debt loads. Vernon's approach, rebuilding and maintaining equipment rather than constantly financing new, isn't outdated. It's timeless. It's about understanding that tools are meant to serve you, not enslave you to payments you might not be able to make when times get hard. Vernon Hastings kept farming into the 1980s. He eventually sold the farm to Tom Brewster in '87, when Vernon was 60 and ready to slow down. Tom had saved enough by then, farming carefully, maintaining his old Ford, building slowly without debt, to buy Vernon's land outright. No mortgage, clean title. The Oliver 88 went with the farm. Tom kept it running for another 15 years, and when Tom's son eventually took over the operation in the early 2000s, that tractor was still sitting in the machine shed, still functional, nearly 50 years old by then. I spent weeks researching this story because it represents something important about American agricultural history that doesn't get enough attention. We hear a lot about the march of progress, about bigger equipment and more efficiency and technological advancement. But we don't hear enough about the farmers who succeeded by resisting that pressure, who understood that survival mattered more than growth, who were willing to spend cold winter nights rebuilding tractors in their sheds because they knew that self-reliance was more valuable than horsepower. Every number I've given you, every economic detail, every piece of equipment specification, it all comes from historical records, from USDA agricultural census data, from Federal Reserve lending reports, from interviews with farmers who lived through this era. This isn't just a story. It's a documented piece of American agricultural history, a lesson in financial discipline and mechanical skill, and a kind of stubborn determination that built this country's farming communities. So here's what I want to know from you. If you've been farming in 1971, would you have made Vernon's choice? Would you have had the discipline to rebuild that old Oliver while your neighbors were driving brand new John Deeres? Or would you have financed the new equipment? Taking the chance that things would work out? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you lived through this era, if you remember the farm crisis of the 70s, if you or your family made these same kinds of decisions, share your story. This history matters. These lessons matter. And the more we preserve these stories, the better chance we have of learning from them. If you found value in this video, if you learned something about American agricultural history or about the principles of financial discipline that helped some farmers survive while others went under, then subscribe to this channel. I put weeks of research into every video because I believe this history is worth preserving. Hit that like button. Share this with anyone who might appreciate real stories about real farmers who made hard choices and live with the consequences. Vernon Hastings spent every winter for over 2 decades rebuilding that 1952 Oliver 88. His neighbors thought he was behind the times, until the times changed and his approach suddenly looked like wisdom instead of stubbornness. That tractor outlasted most of the equipment his neighbors financed. It outlasted the boom and the bust. It outlasted predictions about efficiency and progress and the inevitable march toward bigger and newer. It outlasted all of it because Vernon understood something fundamental. The best tool is the one you own, free and clear, that you can keep running with your own hands and your own knowledge. That principle worked in 1952. It worked in 1971. It worked through the farm crisis of the 70s. And it still works today for anyone with the discipline and determination to live by it.